Now, the construction sector is warning of mounting pressure as the ongoing fuel crisis continues to drive up costs for materials and machinery, with potential knock-on effects for building projects here in Clare and beyond. The Construction Industry Federation is now calling for further government supports to help ease the strain. I've been speaking about the situation with Joanne Tracey. Joanne is Head of Services for the Southern region with the CIF, and I began by asking her how severely construction firms in Clare are being affected by rising fuel and material costs.
Look, firstly, Alan, thanks for taking the chance and giving me the opportunity to have this conversation today. Look, I think to start, it's important to highlight the construction industry has been in a positive space, with some major projects having been greenlit for the Clare and indeed the wider Midwest region in recent times. And this has all led to increased demand in the sector. But look, the rapid rise in costs for firms is a concern. The construction industry recognises the very real concern and uncertainty that the current fuel crisis is causing across our sector. Over recent weeks, we've been in continuous contact with companies nationwide, and it's clear escalating fuel costs, particularly for MGO or green diesel, are putting significant and growing pressure on projects' margins and business viability. The fuel crisis caused a bit of a dent, I suppose, in the confidence of the sector and indeed for our members within the region, about where things are going to go, the potential for supply issues and how we mitigate the very significant cost increases that the sector is facing at present because of the oil price shock. If you take raw materials that go into construction, such as cement, concrete, steel, PVC pipe, they're all generated via fuel-intensive processes. And even with cement, as just an example, that's gone up 15% in just a few weeks. Second big challenge is obviously the fuel that we require to run our plant and machinery on construction sites. So the excavators, the diggers, the mobile cranes, they all run on MGO or green diesel. And of course, there are businesses operating with large fleets of vehicles also. So the recent announcements and packages linked to the fuel increases costed in around 505 million, but they seem to really only focus on the agricultural sector. So we're seeking clarity on that. It's unclear whether the fuel support subsidy scheme is applicable to vehicles essential for construction, such as I said, excavators. So that's where we're at.
I just wonder, Joanne, are you hearing of projects in Clare being delayed or cancelled due to these increases? And just how sustainable is it for builders, both in this county and elsewhere, to absorb those sharp rises in costs like cement and steel?
Oh, absolutely, Alan. Builders need to have the capacity to absorb these short-term increases in their costs. And for smaller and medium-sized builders, it can be a challenge to shoulder these increases and to remain operational. To my knowledge, at present, I haven't heard of any projects that have stalled or been delayed or deferred. We absolutely have to keep building. The construction industry, to be fair, has demonstrated repeatedly that it is resilient. We're committed to delivery and we're ready to deliver at scale. But we are seeking this recognition of the extreme shock to the cost of doing business in construction. That's something we didn't see explicitly referenced in the announcements this week. So that's what we're looking for. We need clarity around the support scheme announced to include all plant, machinery, transport and the construction industry, which is powered by MGO or green diesel, which would be, I suppose, a critical step, first and foremost.
Do you feel, because you are seeking clarity in terms of what, if anything, might be there in the additional 505 million support package for the sector, can we take it from that you feel the government hasn't done enough either in that package or the earlier 250 million euro package, Joanne, to support the construction sector in response to the fuel crisis?
Well, this is what we're seeking clarity on. As I said, Alan, we haven't got that piece of recognition or clarification as yet as to whether the construction industry is included in the recent measures announced or the recent packages announced. So we absolutely that's what we're looking for first and foremost, and I think we can go from there in relation to what additional measures are needed. But until we get that clarity, we're in a little bit of middle ground.
The country, of course, went through 6 days of fuel protests and blockades of fuel depots in Galway and Whitegate down in Cork and the port in Dublin and so on. What kind of effect did those fuel blockades have in terms of the day-to-day operation of construction sites across Clare and the rest of the country?
Well, look, obviously there was an impact from day to day, not least of all from people getting to and from the place of work. Thankfully, as I said, I don't believe any projects have been impacted to the best of my knowledge to date. But we absolutely can't risk any delay in relation to development or construction. Critical infrastructure must go ahead. We have seen the consequences in the past when investment in construction is reduced, resulting in housing and infrastructure shortages. We have to continue to invest in these areas. We need the certainty. We're committed to delivery in the construction industry, and we must keep building.
Is there a real risk, Joanne, that construction sites could come to a complete halt, and perhaps even some builders or developers could go out of business if fuel supply issues continue? And with the US currently blockading the Straits of Hormuz, that sounds like a recipe for an exacerbation of the situation rather than a resolution.
Well, look, there are obviously global impacts that are out of our control, but they are having a direct impact on what's happening here in Ireland. There are certain things that are within our control, and they are the measures that have been announced this week. In relation to construction sites, that's just not a risk we even want to go by or to consider at this point. As I said, builders, it is going to be a challenge to shoulder the increases unless the supports are recognised and acknowledged by government. We absolutely cannot risk any implication of the construction industry being negatively impacted in cost related matters going forward.
You're urging the government to take any and all possible steps to try and mitigate the cost increases that have been experienced. You're looking for further reductions in excise duties on fuel, recognition of the critical importance of reducing costs related to construction critical MGO fuel, removal of the VAT on fuel. You want that aligned with how they're approaching the matter in Spain, and a pause in any increases to carbon tax on fuel materials and other construction related costs, and also a temporary pause in the concrete levy. How likely do you think it is that the government will accede to any or all of that shopping list, Joanne?
Well, look, first and foremost, as I said, clarity on the measures that have been announced this week for the construction industry. That's the first point, and I think that shouldn't be a difficult ask, from our perspective. There are a range of measures people have discussed, and I should say as well, we welcome the deferral of the carbon tax until till October. That is welcome. But in relation to the range of measures people have discussed, including that, the immediate priority, as I've mentioned, is the clarity on the existing support scheme and making sure construction is explicitly included. In relation to concrete levy, that's part of a broader conversation. But the urgent issue this week is ensuring the support scheme covers the construction sector properly.
We do have to leave it there, but Joanne Tracey from the Construction Industry Federation, thank you for joining us on Morning Focus.
Thanks, Alan.